getting them right now.
Good morning.
How are you this morning?
Very fine. And you?
No, I parked it here. I parked it here.
Sorry. Too loud.
That's one way to waste the show.
Uh-huh. Okay, let's see if that's working. How is that? Turning it up. Nope. Sorry. Okay. Can you still hear with that? Need to turn it up just a bit. Okay. So I think that sound is good. Well, I also have to keep an eye on making sure I'm in the camera for the folks upstairs. So yeah, because it can be a little touchy. Yeah, it's the morning for another 2.25 hours. Oh. Okay. Yeah, well, sometimes we just have those days. You just cake on extra deodorant even though that it doesn't help much. Okay, friends, why don't we go ahead and open with prayer. God, we give you thanks for this day, for laughter and humor, for blue skies and rain that has come. We pray that you would continue to water this earth and water our lives, that we might grow and blossom and flourish, that we might help build up your kingdom all around. Guide this time that we might hear you deeply within our souls and also among one another. Guide these words to speak to us, that we might have words to speak to one another. We ask this as all things in Christ's name. And all God's people said, Amen. So we are continuing our Psalms as the first reading for the next few weeks. So our first one that we're looking at is Psalm 100. And then we will flip back to Genesis 18 and listen to the promise to Sarah and Abraham. So listen to Psalm 100. All people that on earth do dwell, sing to the Lord with cheerful voice. Him serve with mirth, his praise forth tell. Come ye before him and rejoice. Know that the Lord is God indeed. Without our aid he did us make. We are his folk, he doth us feed. And for his sheep he doth us take. O enter then his gates with praise. Approach with joy his courts unto. Praise, Lord, and bless his name always. For it is seemly so to do. For why the Lord our God is good, his mercy is forever sure, his truth at all times firmly stood, and shall from age to age endure. So, some of you, if you grew up Presbyterian, you would know that intimately. That was Psalm 100 set to Old Hundredth. I mean, the tune was written for the metrical version of the psalm. It's an old tradition that goes back to the Reformation. So the words, that paraphrase of Psalm 100 was written by William Keith in 1560. And it goes back to the tradition that in the early Reformation, folks in the Reformed tradition would say, well, if it's not in the Bible, we don't do it. So what you sing is psalms. That's all that's in the Bible. And so it used to be throughout everything, no music other than the human voice or something that's there in the Bible. So you could do a lyre maybe, but you couldn't do organs. No, not using organs. So it was 4-part harmony singing the Psalms. And so Psalm 100 was one of those things, and the Old Hundredth was written, the tune was written in 1551. So, I mean, if we're remembering, 1517 was when the Reformation started. So this is right there in the beginning. And so the doxology that we sing to that tune is a tune right from the Reformation. But an old tradition, if you're in some conservative Scottish Presbyterian places, all they sing is psalms. Everything that they sing is psalms. They don't sing anything else. Old-time Presbyterians, because that's what's in the Bible.
Well, there's a lot of stuff in the Bible.
Right, but that was what was recorded as down, so that's what they went with. So there's a guy named Ulrich Zwingli, who was part of the Reformation at the same time as John Calvin. He was an accomplished organist. I mean, he was outstanding. And because he was reading things so closely from the Bible, he was there in Zurich, and he said, nope, we're not doing anything other than psalms. Psalms is all we're singing, and it's only 4-part harmony with people's voices. No other instruments. Yeah.
It makes sense.
Well, they were trying to go back to the sources. They were trying to go back to the original sources, and everything extra that's been added on over the years, toss it out. I mean, it's the folks that say, well, we are a biblical-based church. We're going just on what was there in the Bible. That's exactly what...
I'm missing something.
Okay.
I don't understand that.
You don't understand doing only...
I'm understanding.
There's all kinds of stuff in the Bible.
That's not a song. That's not a song.
Right. But the Psalms were written as songs.
Yeah.
And so that's what the reformers were saying, this is all that we will sing.
They'll sing the song.
We'll only sing the Psalms.
Oh, okay.
And
But
so-
they believe the others.
Oh yeah, they believe the other stuff, but in worship, all we're going to sing, the only thing that we can sing is Psalms. And yes, we can, yeah. So Psalms, make that, yes.
That's an interesting twist.
Yep.
Could play that.
He could, I mean, and violinists too, but he he threw that all out because it was something that stuck with, what he was reading in Scripture. And so that's why I wanted to, use that. So you can hear that if you were reading along with Psalm 100 in the New Revised Standard Version, it adds a few things here and there. There's nothing about sheep, but it's sort of this get the general idea, but also get it in a rhythmic, metric way of putting it. So you can repeat and do multiple verses.
But most psalms do kind of have a meter to them.
They have a rhythm, yeah. They're not necessarily a meter, a strong meter that you can set right to those.
But you kind of get a sense of when you read them.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
That opinion change and why did it change?
Because people, when they started to come to the new world, had choices of what churches they wanted to be part of, and folks were sort of like, I'm not just singing psalms, I like other music too. And so, early on, that was, for 150 years, something like that, into the early 1700s, that was how it was. But then you start to see some changes as time goes on, people are, being able to choose, do I want to be Episcopal or Methodist or whatever? And then there's some movement in that direction. And, again, you get the folks that are pushing back saying, no, we have to stay with just the Psalms.
Where did he get that idea from in the first place?
Well, so if they're trying to get rid of all the papist ideas, trying to get rid of all the smells and bells and extra stuff that's come along over the millennia, over the 1,500 years, well, we don't know where this other stuff comes from, so Palestrina, forget it, all these extra, all this extra frilly stuff, that's all, we don't have any support from it, so all we're going with is support from the Bible. And so Psalms were there in the Bible, so that's what we're going to use, because it helps us get back to those original sources.
You can kind of see where all of that growth and pageantry would take away from faith and
Yeah.
understanding.
Yeah, and there's a balance. I think that there's sometimes the opulence, the majesty, that transporting to a different place that can happen in a more elaborate service. But when they're saying, okay, we need to focus on the word, then you pare it way back. And so again, it's what are your core foundational beliefs that start to shape how worship happens? For me, it's not, you can tell I'm not really high church. I'll make jokes during the service. I'll end up, recognizing I'm messing up. I'm tripping over words, and I'm not wearing a robe during the summer because for me, one of my core things is we're a gathered community, that it's us together, and we all have faults and flaws, and that's okay. Other folks, it's about accessing God's perfection, accessing God's beauty, and that becomes the core part, and so they have a little bit higher view of church. And so that what your first foundational belief is helps to shape how you're acting, making choices. So, Richard, then Patty.
Kind of like a technical or a whatever. The enter his gates with thanksgiving in 4,
Mm-hmm.
and his courts with praise.
Yep.
The reference to the courts would be a court of
A courtyard.
a courtyard, as
It-
opposed to a court of law. Or
Right.
so forth.
Right. So what we're looking at, one of the things about the Hebrew poetry is often they'll take an idea and then they'll intensify it. So, enter into God's gates with thanksgiving. Yay! Enter his courts with praise. Even a little bit bigger. A smaller space, but bigger. So you've hit the gates. give thanks as you're going through the gates, but then when you get inside, go with praise, not just thanksgiving. And so there's sort of this mirror intensification of that. So for the Lord is good, God's steadfast love endures forever, his faithfulness to all generations. So big, broad idea, God's steadfast love endures forever, and more specific, God's faithfulness goes to all generations. And so this is one of the patterns that we see often in Hebrew poetry. So it's not so much the rhyming scheme or the meter, but it's the idea and then the intensification. And so, yeah, we see that. Worship the Lord with gladness, come into God's presence with singing. Again, that intensification. Patty?
In respect to the singing of the Psalms, is there any relationship to that and how Gregorian chant came about?
Is there any relationship between Gregorian chant and the singing of the Psalms? So Gregorian chant happened before what we're talking about with the Reformation. Gregorian chant came about in the 5th, 6th century and thereon, but it was specifically for singing psalms, because part of the monastic community life was you would be singing psalms every single day, 4, 5 times a day, and so with 150 of them, you're going through them pretty rapidly. And so the idea was get it into the memory, because of course people generally aren't reading. And so for the monastics, having the song anchors it. And so Gregorian chant has its roots in psalmody, in the Psalms. And, we see the development through the years that becomes some of the stuff that emerges into the more ornate filigree that becomes the late Renaissance music, the early and late Renaissance music for the church. That it's the Gregorian chant, that tonality that okay, let's take it up a few notches. And so that becomes part of it. But Psalms were intimately involved in the life of the church early on. So there are records of the disciples coming together and singing psalms. There are records of the 1st century, the 2nd century church singing psalms as part of their worship. And so that plays out throughout history in the church. We've sort of slipped away from it a bit because we like words, a variety of words, a variety of tunes. Of course, we want the stuff that we've always sung, but we do want to branch out a bit.
Catholics use Gregorian chant frequently in liturgies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so religious orders still use them. It's part of the daily offices. And so yes, you would get that. Dorothy?
Where does the Song of Songs or Solomon's songs fit in if songs were such an important part of the early church?
Yeah.
It even has it in its title.
So Song of Songs or Song of Solomon is a totally different beast. And actually, Lisa and I were just working on the bulletin for July 9th, where that's going to be the text for the sermon, one of the passages from the Song of Songs. So the Song of Songs really, if you read it, it's about human love. It's about two lovers talking about how amazing this other person is. So, a woman talks about how how white his teeth are and raven black his hair is, and the man talks about how your breasts look like gazelles jumping over the. I mean, this is not PG here, and so folks looked at that and said, we're not going to go there. And so that's why it doesn't show up in the lectionary except one Sunday every 3 years. And over the centuries, folks have interpreted it as a metaphor, as an allegory for the soul and God, how God looks at people's souls and loves them, and how the soul of human beings responds to God. And that allegory makes it a little bit more, palatable in church, but I also think that there's something significant about the Song of Songs where we see and understand human connection to be part of the divine. That those connections that we have with one another, even those intimate times, can be deeply spiritual. So, leading up to July 9th, I think that's the Monday before. I'm going to be in Texas. So we'll have the Sunday sermon, and then on the 10th we'll do double duty, and we will take a look at Song of Songs in addition to the stuff for the following Sunday. But yeah, we will look at that closely, and maybe we'll talk about that on the lead up to July 1st when I'm gone. Maybe we'll do the Bible study on that for that coming Sunday that I'm gone. But Song of Songs, really, reformers especially said, we're not dealing with that. Even though it says Song of Songs, it's more a love song. Have Pete preach on that. That's his call. But I am going to preach on it. I am preaching on it on July 9th. And so we will look at it. We will talk about Song of Songs here in Bible study, and I will preach on it because I think it's important. I think it's really important.
Who wrote Psalms?
Who wrote the Psalms? Well, yeah. We don't really know. There are often there's often this supposition, well, David wrote them. David did not write all of them, if that's the case, because there are a number of ones that say of a particular class of people that I don't think it's not Amorites, but they're Kolahites. There's some group. So each one may have a superscription. So if we look at Psalm 100, in the New Revised Standard Version, we have in italics, all lands summoned to praise God. So that is the New Revised Standard Version editor's summary of that psalm. And then underneath it, it says, a psalm of thanksgiving. That is in regular script, regular type. And that is actually there in the Bible. That's there in the Masoretic text, in the original Hebrew. But if you notice, there's no number with it. It's not numbered as part of the numbering of the Bible. Now, you have to remember that the numbering of the Bible, chapters, psalms, verses, that's a later addition. But folks have said that's not part of the actual text. And then verse 1 starts, make a joyful noise to the Lord, all the earth. Now, if we look at Psalm 100, it says, of David, a psalm. Psalm 101 says, a sovereign's pledge to integrity and justice. And then the superscription says, of David, a psalm. Now, the thing is that of is the Hebrew for a preposition. So if you have this preposition, it could be of David, to David, for David, from David. I mean, because what the Hebrew is la David. That, and so it's just a single letter that they add on to say of or for or to or from. And so you have to read the context. So was this psalm for David, or of David, or from David, or by David? And again, it's not clear. Additionally, David means beloved. So is it of the beloved? Because they don't necessarily have a definitive article in this in Hebrew. So is it of the beloved? Is it of David? We don't know. So that's how folks have said, well, it has la David. It must be of David, from David, by David. But we don't have that. I mean, we do hear along the way that David sings and dances and composes songs. So in all likelihood, some of these probably are. But to say the entirety of the Psalms, no, we can't say that. Ellie.
I just noticed too, at least in my Bible, it has the Psalms divided into sections, like there's books.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not evenly divided. I mean, this
No.
one, that 100 it is, and it's in book 4, it says it's Psalms 90 to 106.
Right.
And the next book is clear to the end of them. What's that?
So that, I mean, that doesn't, that is somewhat arbitrary. Some folk, I mean, there, again, if we remember, the numbering of the Psalms is based on a later tradition from the rabbis, through the years. And so there are actually places where some of these psalms could actually be read as one continuous psalm, that they put, well, this is, I'm just making up numbers here, this is 94 and 95, but when you read 94 and just keep on going into 95, it seems like it's all one psalm.
Well, then some of them are real long.
Right, I mean,
short.
right, and, yeah, I mean, so like 119 is actually an acrostic. So they start with the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet and work their way through, and they do it, I think they do it 25 times. I mean, that's why it's, hundreds of verses long. So it's a long, long, long psalm. And so this is part of the Hebrew poetry, is that it's not necessarily just, the meter and verse that we learned in English class. It's sort of like, okay, we're starting all of this section with Aleph, all of this section with Beit, all of this section with Gimel, and which are the Hebrew letters. So yeah, it goes on and on and on and on. I mean, it needs a 12-step program, on and on and on. Yeah, so the books, that some people's read on it. I think that it does have some tradition with the Jewish rabbis, but I couldn't speak intelligently about that. What else? So anyway, on Sunday, we will go ahead and read that responsively like we did the Psalm this Sunday. And
We used to do it that way.
yeah, absolutely. It's an old tradition. Again, what they also would have done would have been lined out the psalm. And so, the leader would sing, all people that on earth do dwell, and then the congregation would sing back, all people that on earth, and do it that way. Because again, you couldn't read. And so you have someone up there leading it who can read, and so they're leading it, and then it's just back and forth.
Well, why don't we do that anymore? It's sort of nice.
Because you'd have to have someone who's prepared to be that song leader.
You could.
Yeah, then it still becomes the Will Show, which I'm not crazy about, but yeah.
Would that be the means by which they got congregational singing?
Yeah, that's the means by which they got congregational singing. It's part of the ways that they got to biblical literacy, even if folks couldn't read. It's also, part of the place that folks said we need to have everyone able to read. I mean, it was everyone being, public education came out of the Reformation and the Reformed tradition. The Presbyterian Church in Scotland said everyone needs to read so that they can access the Word of God. And so that was critical here. And so the Psalms would have been something that you would have learned to read first because, you're hearing it on a regular basis, and then, okay, here I'm putting these words that I know, connecting them with these little squiggles, and making it so that suddenly I can comprehend. So, this was less about the psalm itself because it's fairly straightforward. But I wanted us to explore sort of what's happened with the Psalms, how they've been used, and so anyway, that's what I got for the Psalm today. So why don't we flip over to Genesis 18, and we will have fun with Abraham. So we started yesterday and last Monday with Genesis 12, where we have Abram and Sarai, that they leave Haran and head to Canaan, and they go back and forth. They go to Egypt because there's famine in the land, and there's a variety of things that happen. And then chapter 2 earlier, God makes a covenant with Abram and says, okay, with this covenant, you are no longer to be called Abram, but Abraham. And your wife is no longer Sarai, but Sarah. And by making those shifts in the names, it changes it from, I should have looked this up earlier, but it changes it from sort of father of none to father of many, and mother of few to mother of many. The shifts in the name signify a shift in their understanding of themselves and how they're supposed to be identified. But with Abram, it's this definite shift to now he becomes sort of this father of many, even though at that point he still has no kids. And so in the intervening chapters, actually it's just the previous chapters in chapter 17. In chapter 17, we have this promise of God that you will have offspring, and then we have Sarah say, I'm still barren. Here's the slave, Hagar, have a kid with her. And from that, Ishmael comes along. And so we'll talk about Hagar and Ishmael next week. But just to get you an idea of the timeline, that this is going on there. And this is not uncommon for a woman who's barren to say, here's a slave, go ahead, and then it'll be my kid too. That we're just going to call this, it's your son and my child as well, even though the woman who bore him is going to be the wet nurse. It gets complicated. We're talking about Song of Songs, this gets more complicated than that. But then we end up having this show up in verse 18. So we'll read chapter 18, 1 through 15. The Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre as he sat at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. He looked up and saw 3 men standing near him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent entrance to meet them and bowed down to the ground. He said, "My Lord, if I find favor with you, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought and wash your feet and rest yourselves under the tree. Let me bring a little bread that you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant." So they said, "Do as you have said." And Abraham hastened into the tent to Sarah and said, "Make ready quickly 3 measures of choice flour, knead it, and make cakes." Abraham ran to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to the servant, who hastened to prepare it. He then took curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared and set it before them. And he stood by them under the tree while they ate. They said to him, "Where is your wife Sarah?" He said, "There in the tent." Then one said, "I will surely return to you in due season, and your wife Sarah shall have a son." And Sarah was listening at the tent entrance behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age. It had ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, "After I have grown old and my husband is old, shall I have pleasure?" The Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old?' Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? At the set time I will return to you in due season, and Sarah shall have a son." But Sarah denied, saying, "I did not laugh," for she was afraid. He said, "Oh yes, you did laugh."
Realize one of the 3 was God.
So Abraham didn't realize one of the 3 was God. This is a little bit touchy. So one of the ways that Christians have interpreted this is that all 3 of these people, it's God. It's the Trinity. It's one of those images that Christians say, "See, there's 3. 3 in 1, 1 in 3. It's the Trinity," even though the word's never used.
How many people actually saw God?
How many people actually saw God and lived?
Moses?
Well, Moses, yes, kinda.
Kind of.
We also have Elijah and Elisha. No, it's Elisha, who flees to the mountain of God, and he sees God's backside as God passes by. But there's still that tradition: if you see God, you're going to die. And so, so there's really this mixed tradition there about, is this God? Is this angels? God speaking through angels? Yeah, all these things become question marks. But it's sort of this weird. And Jacob also wrestles with God, but is it an angel or is it God? And it's not. So it's really this weird, maybe not.
And that was at night.
Yeah, and it was at night. But then these all become question marks. But here, they're sort of like, "My Lord, stay, rest, have a little water to wash off your feet, maybe a little bite to eat." And then he goes and has a full calf prepared. I mean, this isn't wait here for 20 minutes and then be on your way. This is hours. Because
Probably nobody saw.
well, or everyone saw. I mean, again, it's sort of that, lack of clarity in the biblical witness. But when we listen to this, it's not clear whether Abraham knows exactly who this is, showing up or not, because one of the things is this is still the ancient, Near East. It's still this strong encouragement to have a really robust welcome of the stranger. Because again, if folks are traveling in this area and they're just traveling, you want to welcome them because it's going to help keep them alive. I mean, water can be a little scarce, food, again, scarce. So by having that hospitality to strangers, it's a core value. And so it's not quite clear whether Abraham recognizes this is God at the first or just strangers, but then, he's sitting there in the entrance to the tent, probably dozing off a little bit. He looks up, and there are 3 people suddenly there. So didn't see them coming. So that may indicate, okay, there's something special about them. And then, my Lord, in the New Revised Standard Version, verse 3 says, he said, my Lord, that Lord is not in all caps. So that indicates that this is not the 4-letter name of God being used here. This is more about the word Lord.
But in the 14th verse, it says, is anything too wonderful for the Lord?
Right. And that means that is what we might have previously translated as Yahweh or Jehovah. Because the way that the folks who are making this translation do it is if you have, like in verse 1, the Lord is all caps, that means that it's that 4-letter Yahweh or Jehovah. Whereas, and from Hebrew tradition, whenever you see that, you say Adonai, which that word means Lord. And so it would be the Jehovah appeared to Abraham, and then in verse 3, he said, my Adonai, if I find favor. So what's going on here is we have this 2 different words that are translated to the same word in English. And that's why they have the indication of all caps to say this is a proper name being used here. And that's opposed to Elohim, which is another word that means God. So we have different words going on here for the Hebrew translation. So, yeah, Richard.
I may be ahead of myself or
Yeah.
ahead of the whole thing,
No.
here, but in 14, there's major miracles or something going on here. Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? At
Right.
the set time, I will return to you in due season, and Sarah shall have a son. If she's barren,
Right.
how can this possibly be?
How can anything be too wonderful for the Lord? I mean, that's exactly what's going on here, is that this is a miracle because, she's been barren, she and Abram left Haran when they were 70, and that was a while ago. I mean, so we're talking 75, 80, 90, somewhere in there. I'd have to look, but I mean, they're old, even by our standards of longer lives. They're significantly old, and if I'm being totally honest, I'm not yet 50. I'm close to it. How the heck do you handle a kid? I mean, I wouldn't want to handle a kid at this age. No way. I mean, we've heard folks, with modern medicine being able to have kids at 65, and I'm sort of like, why? Why? I mean, it's hard enough at, 35. Why would you go 65 when everything's already aching a bit?
Is a year?
I don't know. I mean, that always becomes a question mark of, is it a year or is it a season? And so if it's a season, you divide by 4, but that still doesn't make sense. And so, because then they'd be like 25 or, again, it's part of the storytelling. The exact making total sense, because we have, people living to 800 and 900 years old, which we simply know that bodies wear out before then.
I
And
think
so-
there's a sense of humor too in the fact that Sarah, I see it as she laughing about it because she certainly is aware of
Yeah, this is ridiculous.
But she laughs to herself,
Right.
and yet,
God still hears it through the tent.
exactly.
Yep, God still knows. And so what is this? I mean, is this, I can't believe it, is too good to be true kind of laughter? Or is it, no way is this happening? You're crazy, whoever you are. And so that becomes a question. And the thing is, God, we listen to this and it's sort of like, is anything too wonderful for God? And we can almost hear it as condemnation about Sarah, that, you're doubting God. But then Sarah, there's also something weird happening where they're sort of talking through the tent flap. They're not, because again, part of it is the guests are still kept outside. Even though you're welcome to hospitality, you're not necessarily welcomed in where all the family and such are. We'll still, keep a little distance so that you don't think that you're going to stay here for weeks and weeks and weeks and mooch off of us. That's part of the hospitality. But the conversation now happens through the tent flap. And so it can almost sound like, Sarah laughed and then, the Lord said to Abram, why did Sarah laugh? Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? And then says, no, I'm really going to do this. And then Sarah denied it, saying, I didn't laugh because she was afraid. But God's response is, oh, yes, you did laugh. It almost feels playful to me. Oh, yes, you did. I heard you. Don't deny it. And it's almost like, okay, you're allowed to have your wonder, your question marks, that God's not saying this is, unacceptable, that you shall bow and acknowledge, and any, distrust is unacceptable. That doesn't feel like the case.
How come we use men here instead of angels or women or?
Because that's what's there in the Hebrew text.
And the
The-
Hebrew text actually says
The,
men,
yes, the word there is men.
because in the beginning you think of them as men, but
Yeah.
as time goes by.
Yeah, it's sort of this weird transformation, sort of it's ambiguous.
Messy.
Yeah, it's messy. So, yeah.
I often try to find myself understanding our current way of thinking about things or how history made us think about things based on where it was way back then. Way back then, when Abram had a child, but not by Sarah. They had the child, and that's the one that the Muslims believe
Mhm.
is the father of their faith. Yet we as Christians, well, and maybe Jewish also, said no, a justified child had to be, between the man and the wife. And that's interesting how we've done in history.
We'll talk about that next week, because we will. I do want us to talk about, how is Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, how are they connected, and how does it work with the Abrahamic saga? How does that? Because all three faiths trace their origin back to Abram and Abraham. And so there's actually some shifts in how Muslims interpret the stories. So like the binding of Isaac, where, God says, take your only son and take him to this mountain to sacrifice him. For Islam, it's not Isaac that goes, it's Ishmael. And so there's some reworking of the stories as we go. Now, that's actually the lectionary text for Pete, for the Sunday that Pete's here. I doubt he's going to preach on it.
But what I find interesting is how current society, how this who's accepted and so forth. Because even now, for instance, for immorality,
Mhm.
as to who, like the firstborn and so forth, were out of wedlock.
Yeah.
marriage.
Yeah, how is legitimacy
Yeah,
decided? And it's also part of the reason that Sarah, after Isaac is born and weaned, so he's probably 2 years old. He's playing with Ishmael, and she sees them and says, "Get rid of Ishmael, because I want only my kid to be around, because I don't want any danger to the inheritance." I mean, that's exactly what happens. And it's sort of like, okay, you didn't just experience having a baby at 80 or 90 and think that, okay, I need to protect my own. You think God won't do that after all these promises? But we still see human nature play out. There's still human nature engaged and involved with all of this. And so when we're listening to this passage, I find that God doesn't condemn the laughter. He says, well, do you really believe that anything's too great for God? And so sometimes that sort of incredulous view of the world and of God is okay. Us being amazed by what God promises and being skeptical, we aren't the first, we won't be the last. And so, it's okay. We can see this even in these paragons of faith, because they did up and leave, and even they are sort of like, wow, this is too much. I mean, they've already made provisions in the previous chapter to take care of it, even though that isn't what God said. Because God had promised a child to Abraham and Sarah. But they were sort of like, okay, impatient, let's get this going. And so that's why Hagar came along. Hagar was used. Yeah. What else? What else stands out for you about this passage?
Hagar already had the child.
Yes, Hagar already had the child at this time. If we look at the previous, chapter, Abraham was 99 years old when he was circumcised, and Ishmael was 13 years old. So that's right before this episode happens. So yeah, so they've been out there wandering for 29 years. Ishmael's been around for 15 of those.
I probably wasn't listening, but how many children did Abraham and Sarah have?
Uno,
Just the one.
yeah, just Isaac. And then, Abraham had Ishmael as well. Now, there's the possibility that there could be other offspring, but that they aren't included in the numbering because they were with, other slaves that just weren't included. We have, when we listen to the story of Jacob, who becomes Israel, and we look at the 12 tribes of Israel, there are some of those that are, so remember, Jacob had Rachel and Leah. And each of those gave Jacob a slave to procreate with as well. And so there are some that are Rachel's children, and that is Benjamin. I might have Rachel and Leah mixed up. I don't remember that, but I think it's Rachel. That there's Joseph and Benjamin, and those two get to be favorites. And then there's the other ones that are Leah's kids, and then there's also some of these that are the servant girls of Rachel and Leah. And so the 12 named chosen sons are not all by the 2 wives. And so this could have been going on for Abraham as well, because that's only 2 generations back, because Jacob is Abraham's grandson. So a little bit different understanding of how, inheritance and lineage and family all works. It's a little bit different than what we've got.
Does the Jewish faith stick just with one wife?
They do now,
Yeah,
but this time wasn't the case. I mean, according to according to the Bible, David had several wives. Solomon had hundreds. And so, yeah, that wasn't, and when you think about it, the high rate of death during childbirth would necessitate that if you want to make sure that lineage is continuing on, you have multiple wives, because, they're going to die in statistically, some of them are
Considered a sin?
not at that point,
Well, then why is it a sin now?
because things have shifted and changed.
No. I don't think you can.
You want to talk with Natalie? No, I'm serious. So there's also, so there's that point about another person's wife. So that's definitely a sin, and that's been there throughout. But having multiple wives is,
Well, didn't the Bible say one man and one woman?
it says that, no, it says that a man shall, that they're 2 flesh that become one, but it doesn't say just one man and one woman. That's not biblical text, because throughout Genesis, there's the thing is, he would have to marry them rather than just go sleeping around. Now, it's part of the reason that the Church of Latter-day Saints said, okay, it's fine to have polygamous marriage, to have multiple wives, because there's definitely that biblical, imperative. Now, we as a society have said, no, this is a changing and changed understanding. And it's been that way for a long time. Part of it is shifts and changes in the Middle East with Alexander the Great and his conquering of the Middle East. Because remember, Israel is not this isolated country that's living in a bubble. It's interacting with Egypt, with Syria, with all these countries in the Middle East. And the Greek understanding, was that it's one man, one woman. Middle Eastern culture still allows multiple marriages, that a man can have multiple wives as long as he can provide for it. And that's part of what we see in Muslim countries, that is still allowed. However, when you have Alexander the Great come through in the, I want to say, 4th century BCE, there are significant shifts in the culture because he settles his veterans in different cities along the way. And so the Jewish people that are there are interacting with them, and there's changes in understanding at that point.
That's culture.
Yeah, it is It is culture. It absolutely is culture.
But it's not the law.
Right. So we are welcome from a biblical standpoint to have multiple wives. However, we live in a culture that says that's not appropriate.
Well, who says it's appropriate to have multiple wives? Where
because,
does it say that in the Bible?
well, because we have the example of people having multiple
Well,
wives.
you have it right now too, but it's still, that doesn't mean it's approved.
I'm not saying it is. I'm saying from a biblical perspective, if we're looking at the Old Testament, if we're looking at Genesis, go for it. If we look further on, it doesn't show up.
But that doesn't, you're telling me it was okay in Genesis, but it's not okay in, Matthew.
Yep.
I can't accept that. I don't, a sin is a sin is a sin, or it isn't a sin.
Mm-hmm. You're absolutely right.
And you don't change with the times.
Well, I would suggest that that our understanding of God does evolve. Our understanding of who God is and how God reveals God's self does change. Because when we have Jesus show up, we start to see the world differently. We start to understand God differently. There's still continuity with the Old Testament, but there are shifts. The understanding of what the Messiah was supposed to look like was different from the Old Testament prophets to when Jesus is there interpreting what's supposed to happen. And so it's partially because we as human beings have limited view. I'm not saying God has changed, but our understanding has shifted.
The Messiah is supposed to look,
Right. So,
nobody knows then and nobody knows now.
well, so the Messiah was understood to ride in as a warrior and throw out the enemies of the people of Israel. And that's what the people were expecting of Jesus, that he was going to start a political revolt and push out the Romans. And instead, he ends up dying at the hands of the Romans and is resurrected. And that is what the Messiah was truly supposed to do.
But there's still people that believe it today that he's gonna ride in. It's a Jewish faith.
Yep. And there's also people in the Christian faith that look at it and say, you know, he's going to ride in and he's going to take over the world instead of seeing it more as a metaphorical stance. So, again, we're looking at things, and our perspective is different here than back there. And so things do change and evolve. So, I mean, we could justify multiple marriage. We easily could justify multiple marriage on a biblical standpoint. However, we also have Christ who goes to a marriage in the wedding in Canaan, and it's one bride, one groom. So there's also that example. And that, for me, tends to be a little bit more definitive because of the weight that I place on Jesus as, you know, as the Messiah, as Christ, as God present. So,
Can we then also change the Ten Commandments a little bit? Maneuver that around a little bit differently?
well, which 10 Commandments? Because
It's way back when.
right, but there are variations in how the 10 Commandments are written, even in the Old Testament.
But not what they really,
No, the meaning is still there, but yeah.
so we can't massage that a little bit.
Well, but remember, what does Jesus say? Tell me, you know, he asked them to summarize the law. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul. Love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus also takes those 10 commandments and says, you know, it says, do not covet your neighbor's wife or property. And Jesus says, anyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery in his heart. So Jesus is reinterpreting those and pushing it even a little bit further. So Jesus is already doing reinterpretation. That's a tradition. And so it's not necessarily throwing out the past, but It's adjusting our view of it. And so,
Call it adjusting, I guess, I call it explaining. He's
Okay.
making an understanding for us, he's not,
okay, yeah, I think that's semantics. I mean, I could go with explaining. He's explaining, but he's also, if you go with just the letter of the law with the Ten Commandments on adultery, it's just, going in and, and yeah.
well, committing adultery would be a violation of not loving your neighbor as yourself.
Absolutely. But Jesus says that not loving your neighbor as yourself applies to this adultery where you even look at someone else with lust. That it's taking it to a little bit further extent. And so when we're thinking about the Bible and saying, okay, we have multiple traditions, multiple ways of seeing this, then we have to struggle with it. And that's, to me at least, that struggle of trying to figure out what does this mean, both intellectually but also with the heart, pushes us to understand God a little bit more deeply.
Well, I'm German,
Oh, I understand. I understand. You're a good Lutheran. Here's what it is, and it's unchanging,
And the Mormons came along.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, anyway, folks, I'm sorry to say we're 5 minutes over. So we will next week. Next week, I guarantee you, we're going to have an interesting discussion because we're going to be talking about Hagar and Ishmael, and I'm going to actually bring in some of the connection to Islam and how this how we have different readings. So what? Let's meet earlier. Well, we'll probably do a little bit shorter on the psalm, because we'll do the psalm as well. But today I wanted to, we talked about what psalms do, and we brought in some of that metrical singing. So, shall we have our benediction? May the Lord watch between me and thee while we are absent one from the other. Thank you, friends. I love these discussions. I hope you guys have a great rest of the week.